The Belgian Defense Forces is the national military of Belgium. The King of the Belgians is the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces. The Belgian Armed Forces was established after Belgium became independent in October 1830. Since that time, Belgian armed forces have fought in World War I, World War II, the Cold War, Kosovo, Somalia and Afghanistan. The Paracommando Brigade intervened several times in Central Africa for maintaining public order and evacuation of Belgian citizens. The armed forces comprise 4 branches: the land component, the air component, the marine component and the medical component. When Belgium broke away from the Netherlands in 1830, it was initially expected that a neutral buffer state, with its borders guaranteed by France, Britain and Prussia, could avoid the need for an expensive permanent military force, relying instead on the part-time militia of the existing Guard Civic. The need for a regular army was however soon acknowledged. The basis for recruitment was one of selective conscription, under which exemptions could be purchased by obtaining substitutes. In practice, this meant that only about a quarter of each year's eligible intake actually served, with the burden falling on the poorer classes. As part of the national policy of even-handed neutrality, the 19th century Belgian army was deployed as an essentially defensive force in fortifications facing the Dutch, German and French borders. Mobilization plans simply required reservists to report to their depots, without arrangements being made in advance for deployment in a particular direction or against a particular enemy. Recruitment difficulties caused the army to remain below its intended strength of 20,000 men. Although new legislation in 1868 tightened the basis for conscription, the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 required full mobilization for nearly a year, a process which showed up serious training and structural weaknesses. The presence of Belgian forces in strength along the country's borders, supported by intelligence provided by the Belgian Civil Security Service, did however ensure that the combat at no time spilled over into Belgian territory. As late as the 1890s, the Belgian army still retained a system of selective service. At a time when most European states were moving to a principle of universal obligation. According to the Prussian model, in Belgium conscripts were selected through the drawing of ballots, but individuals could escape service by paying for substitutes. This system favored the well-off and had been discarded elsewhere as inefficient and unpatriotic. For those conscripted, the terms of service required 8 years in the regular army, followed by 5 years as a reservist. Various categories of volunteer enjoyed such privileges as being able to specify their branch of service, bounties and higher pay. The Papal Army based in Rome included from 1860 a battalion-sized unit known as the Tirailleurs, Franco-Belges, recruited amongst volunteers from both countries. This became the Pontifical Zouaves in 1861 and fought as an allied force on the French side in 1871. During the Franco-Prussian War, in 1864 a Corps Expeditionnaire Belge was raised for service in Mexico. Originally intended to serve as the guard of the Belgian-born Empress Charlotte, this 1,500-strong force was largely drawn from volunteers seconded from the Belgian army. Known popularly as the Belgian Legion, it saw active service in Mexico as part of the imperial forces, before returning to Belgium for disbandment in March 1867. From 1885 the Force Publique was established as the military garrison and police force in the Belgian Congo, then under the direct rule of King Leopold II, initially led by a variety of European mercenaries. This colonial force was subsequently officered by Belgian regulars after 1908. From December 1904 a small detachment of Belgian troops was permanently based in China as the Guard of the Belgian Legation in Beijing. Reforms undertaken in the early years of the 20th century included the abolition in 1909 of the system of drawing lots for the selection of the annual intake of conscripts. In 1913, compulsory and universal military service for men was established in Belgium, while this enabled actual peacetime strength to be increased to 33,000 men. This was only sufficient to provide a basis for the creation of 7 under-strength divisions plus artillery and fortress troops. The Belgian military was also affected by political and popular reliance on the supposedly certain protection of the country's internationally guaranteed neutrality. In the words of the historian Barbara W. Tuchman, the army was considered superfluous and slightly absurd. Training and discipline was slack. Equipment inadequate and even field uniforms were old-fashioned and impractical. Although improvements in the Belgian army had been uneven during the 19th and early 20th centuries, one area of successful reform had been that of